Hi everyone, I'm Abigail. This is Bentley. Welcome to another Two Kids interview. We are joined by New York Times bestselling author Alan Gratz. Mr. Gratz has written the graphic novel Captain America: The Ghost Army, Grenade, Allies, Project 1065, Prisoner B3087, the #1 New York Times bestsellers, 2 Degrees, Ground Zero, and Refugee, plus much more. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. Love the adventure shirt.
Why have you decided to write many of your books set around World War II?
It all started for me. I hadn't planned to write about World War II specifically. I loved writing history. Already written some books that were set in the past and that a couple that maybe touched on World War II, but I hadn't really focused on World War II until I met a guy named Jack Gruner. And Jack was a real person, and he, as a kid, survived 10 different Nazi concentration camps during World War II. It was an incredible true story. He was looking for somebody to tell the story of his life in a book. And he came to me and said, do you want to work on this book together? And I was like, oh my gosh, yes, that's an amazing story. So I worked with Jack to tell his story. That became the book Prisoner B3087. And I thought, well, that's it. That was my World War II book. It was about the Holocaust. It was about this one person specifically. I love writing history, but I didn't have any plans to go on and write more World War II books right then. The next book I wrote was Code of Honor, which is set in the present day. At least it was when it came out. But then I started getting fan mail for that book. I got more fan mail for Prisoner B3087 than I got for all of my other books combined. And the number one thing that young readers said was, when are you going to write more books about World War II? And I was like, okay, I hear you. I hear you. And so I pretty quickly got back to writing about World War II. And so the short answer is the Prisoner B3087. But the continuing answer is so many young readers keep loving books about World War II and keep asking for them. And I figure as long as you guys want to keep reading them, I'll keep writing them. I love doing the research and doing the writing.
We do. We do.
Cool.
Most of your books are your own characters. You recently wrote a graphic novel, Captain America: The Ghost Army. What was it like writing for an iconic character like Captain America?
It was totally fun. So I'm a huge comic book fan. I've been a fan since I was a kid. I've read comics all my life. I still read comic books. And when I found out that Marvel and Scholastic were working together to do graphic novels for young readers based on Marvel characters, they had already done a Miles Morales graphic novel. They'd done a Ms. Marvel graphic novel. They did a Shuri from Black Panther. And I saw this and I was like, oh my gosh, I got to get in on this. So I called up all the people I knew and I was like, hey, it's Scholastic. I already published with Scholastic. It's Marvel. I love Marvel. Can I write a character for you guys? And they said, well, we're interested. What character would you want to do? And I was like, oh man, there's so many great characters. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Like you guys said, I already write about World War II. People know me for World War II. What if I wrote about Cap in World War II? And Marvel loved it and Scholastic loved it. And the next thing you know, Wham Bam Pow was writing superhero comic books, which was awesome. So it's been amazing. It's interesting because, as you said, you can't change the character a lot. You can't like give Captain America a brother he didn't have, or kill off a character, from the comics or something like that. So you're more limited in the kind of stories that you can tell. But Marvel has such a really fantastic world. They've been doing comics since the 1930s. Since for over 80 years, Cap has been a character, and so there's tons of history there to pull from. And so really what I did was, I already write a lot of historical fiction. I treated writing this comic book like I was writing Cap as a character with his own history. I went back and I researched a lot of what happened to that character over time in the comic books and built my story using sort of this fantasy, this comic book fictional history, and just treated it the same way. So I think fantasy and history have a lot in common in terms of the writing. In both cases, you have to know a lot about that world before you can ever tell a story in it.
A couple of days ago, we interviewed author Alex Gino, a trans author who is now having books banned in countries throughout the country. In 2017, you wrote the book Ban This Book. Banning books have become a much bigger issue since your book on the topic came out. When you wrote the book, did you see that it was getting worse? And why did you decide to write that, which was much different than your other books?
Yeah, those are all great questions. Thanks. So yes, Ban This Book came out, I think, in 2017, 2018, somewhere around there. And it took me a couple of years to write it. It isn't like my others. My others often have sort of life and death situations in them or focus on a big event in history. And this one wasn't life and death. It didn't focus on a big, big event. But yes, I was traveling the country. I was visiting a lot of libraries and a lot of schools. And I was talking to a lot of librarians. And I knew that book banning and book challenging were things that were happening all over the country. And I wanted to write a book about it. And you're right, this came out a few years ago, and things have changed quite a lot. So unfortunately, things have gotten worse, as you've pointed out. Alex and other authors are seeing their books banned, not just because one person doesn't think they're appropriate for kids, but because maybe somebody thinks the author themselves isn't appropriate, right? Like they think that there's something wrong with that person. We're seeing books being challenged because of people's race. We're seeing people their books being challenged because of their gender or how they identify, and without even thinking about the book, and then the book gets banned. So like I've had books challenged and banned, but really just for content, not for who I am. I can't imagine having a book challenged or banned because of who I am as a person, but that's exactly what we're having now. And you're right, when I wrote Ban This Book, it wasn't as bad as it is now. Somebody might say, oh, that book is inappropriate for kids, so I don't want anybody to read it. And then they would challenge a book and try to get it removed from the shelf. Nowadays, we're having people go after the authors and their philosophy, their way they live their lives as well. And so I wrote this book because I saw something that was happening back then. The ALA had about 300 reports every year of people challenging or banning books. They thought that was not everybody was reporting it. So maybe there was like 1,000 of those things happening around the country every year. But now we're seeing 10 times that. And it's a real organized effort to try and ban books. So if I were writing that book today, I would write it differently. I would write it about the people who are being banned, the people who as authors are being challenged because of who they are. Back then, I just wrote it to be about books that are challenged because of the content of those books. That still happens, but it's become much more personal and much more political now than it ever was before. But I think the core message of Ban This Book is the same, that nobody has the right to tell you what you can and can't read, except your parents.
You have written other books that allow readers to see current problems in a different way, like climate change in 2 degrees, and the plight of refugees in the book Refugee. What do you hope the readers will get out of these books?
It's another good question. For sometimes early in my career, I wrote books that were just for fun, where I wanted to just entertain. And I think that the books, there's place on the shelf for books that just entertain. I love going to movies or watching TV shows that just entertain. I love reading books that are just entertaining. But there are also some things in the world that we need to talk about. Things like climate change, for example, things that we need to tackle as a society, that us turning off our lights in our house or not flying as much or recycling, all those things help. But individually, even if individually we all did those things, it isn't going to be enough. They help, but what we need is real fundamental change. And for that, we need everybody to come together and agree that we need to make these changes and to make them as a community, to make them as counties, as cities, as states, as whole countries, as the world. So I started seeing things like this, things that I felt really passionate about in the world. And I thought, well, what if I could write both an entertaining book, hopefully a book that you can't put down, that's a page turner, but also that has some comment on the world today. And so I kind of started doing that without thinking about it, without sitting down and saying, I'm going to write books that entertain and have a message. I just kind of started doing it because I felt really passionately about the things that I was writing about. And then I watched an interview with Jordan Peele, who is a movie director, and he was talking about his movies as social thrillers. He was like, they are thrilling, they keep you on the edge of your seat, but they also have a social element too, where I talk about something that's happening in society and I make a comment on it. I thought, oh, that's when it clicked for me. I was like, that's kind of what I've been thinking about doing. I hadn't put a name to it, but now I kind of think of the books that I write as social thrillers. in the sense that I want to write a book you can't put down, but I also want to talk about racism. I also want to talk about climate change. I also, want to talk about the refugee situation in the world, for example, or the way that we respond to violence and the cycles of revenge, that kind of thing. So every time I write a book now, I'm trying to think about not only how do I keep you turning the page, how do I make this exciting, but also what am I trying to say? I don't have all the answers. I wish I had the answer to how to fix climate change, because then I'd be out there on the street corner yelling it to everybody. But I think the first thing that I can help with is trying to bring awareness to the situation and say, we have a problem. Now, I mean, this summer we've seen the wildfires and the smoke and the flooding, and the super temperatures. It's like 100 degrees in the ocean off of the coast of Florida right now. So like, I think we're seeing it more and more. But for some people, you still have to kind of, knock them on the head and say, hey, look around, check out what's going on. And I hope that my books do that.
Some days we haven't been able to play outside.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really rough. The air quality here, I live in Asheville, North Carolina. And so we're not up north where the smoke is. We're not too far down south where the superheat is. But some days it's been so bad that just walking downtown to go shopping or to get something to eat, like we have to pull our masks back out from COVID so that we're not breathing the bad air. It's been that tough. So I can't imagine being a kid today and not being able to go outside and play. I had spent half of my youth outside in the woods playing around, but not sure I could do it today.
What is your process when putting a book together? Do you decide the end before the middle, or do you put it together in order?
Okay, yeah, I put it together in order. In fact, this big board back here behind me, this is my outline board. So all those little note cards up there, those are chapters in the new story that I'm working on. So I have this big board. My wife made it for me. It's actually just insulation board from like Home Depot with fabric over it. The yellow stripe doesn't mean anything. It's just decoration. But all those little cards, and then I, of course, put a whole bunch of junk around it because I love my toys and junk. But all of those little cards back there are chapters, and I lay out my story all the way from beginning to end before I ever write the very first word of it. So it might take me a month to put together that outline. And before I put that together, if I'm doing something based on history, I've done a lot of research. I might have done 6, 7, 8, 9 months of research, found ideas, come up with different ideas for scenes. I write out all those scenes on note cards, and then I start pinning them up in different places to see where that story might take me. And some stuff doesn't fit, and I just chuck it. And sometimes it is in the wrong place and I have to move it. Sometimes there's gaps between stuff and I have to fill in by coming up with new pieces of the story or doing more research. But I figure out the whole story from the beginning, that's up there, to the end, which is down there for me. And I know where I'm going the entire time. So I'm a big outliner. I know there are people who like to kind of just throw themselves into a first draft and make it up as they go. And that's how they find their story. And there's people like me that are plotters. There's as many different ways to write a book as there are authors. And this is just the way that works best for me.
What story is it back there now?
So back here is a graphic novel I'm hoping that I get to do about a bear who served in World War II. True story. Not done yet. I'm still working on the outline.
Has your daughter impacted your writing in any way?
A little bit. So my daughter is now 20, almost 21. She turns 21 next month. So, but she grew up with my career. And the funny thing is that when she was born, my wife and I had to decide if one of us was going to stay home and take care of her, if we were going to send her off to daycare. My wife had the better paying job, and I had wanted to be a writer all my life, and I'd been writing stuff and sending it out, and I'd gotten some good rejection letters, which is a thing. They say, no, but we like your stuff. Send us your next thing that you write. So I felt like I was getting closer. So I quit my job and I stayed home, and I was a stay-at-home dad, and I took care of my daughter. Her name is Josephine. We call her Joe. And so I stayed home with Joe, and I worked on writing another book. And the very first book that I wrote while I was a stay-at-home dad became Samurai Shortstop, and that was my very first published book. And so by the time my daughter was old enough to go to school, I was old enough to stay home and not go back to work. And so I got to have all that time with her when she was a baby and a toddler, and then when she was old school age, I was able to stay home and stay a full-time writer, and I've this has been my full-time job ever since. So she's really been involved in my whole career in that sense about getting me started. But then the time that she was most influential on a particular story was she came home from kindergarten, I think it was, and she was talking about, she was really quiet. She's usually just chatterbox. And she was really quiet in her car seat. And I was like, hey, what's going on? And she said, well, I was on the playground and I was playing fairies, and she loved to build these fairy houses and stuff. And she said, one of the older kids came over and told me that fairies don't exist. And I'm really sad about that. And I as a parent, I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do here? Because, fairies don't exist, but I want my daughter, who's a little kid, to dream and to play and to have that fantasy while she's little, right? But I also don't want to lie to her or anything. And she was quiet for a little while, and she said, you know what? Even if they don't exist, I'm going to keep pretending that they do because it's more fun. And I was like, boom, you just figured out like life itself right there, kid. Like when you figure out that you want to believe in something, even when other people don't, you go for it, right? And like you own it. And it made me come up with an idea. I ended up coming up with an idea for a story from that. I ended up writing a book called Fantasy Baseball that was about a world where characters from kids' books exist because kids believe in them. And taking that old sort of Tinkerbell idea from Peter Pan, where if you believe in Tinkerbell enough, she comes back to life. And so that book, Fantasy Baseball, had a lot to do with my daughter believing in these fantasy characters and bringing them to life in her mind. And so I dedicated that book specifically to her. The ironic thing is that my daughter didn't read most of my books through much of her life, even when she was the right age for them. I kept saying, do you want to read this? And she'd be like, no. I'm like, okay, thanks. So one day she comes home from school. She's in middle school, and she's like, hey, I think I want to read one of your books. I'm like, really? I've been trying to get you to read my books forever. What happened? She said, well, one of my friends said I should read it. I was like, oh, thanks a lot. Your dad told you to read one and you said no, but then your friend said to read it, and she did. So now she's read a few of my books, but she grew up with me as an author. So for her, it was nothing special. She's like, yeah, my dad writes books. She didn't see like the 10, 15 years of me sending stuff out and getting rejections before that.
After you finish your first draft, how much do you revise the book?
Oh man, it seems like the revisions go on forever. So I write the book, I turn it in, my editor reads it, then she writes me back an edit letter, and she says in the first paragraph, this is the best book I've ever read. This is amazing. It's going to be a huge hit. Now here's everything that's wrong with it. And then it's like a 10-page letter of all the stuff I've got to go fix. So then I go back in and I rework it, sometimes so badly. That book behind you guys, Allies, that one, I rewrote the first draft of that book so much that in the second draft, the character who'd been the main character in the first draft didn't even show up, right? Like I changed it so much, I changed around all the main characters and everything. It was a radical rewrite from the first draft to the second draft. So usually it's not that bad, but I ended up rewriting. I ended up rewriting something like the second draft is a huge rewrite. Then the third one is a big one, but not as big. And then the fourth one is a little bit smaller. And what you do is every time you rewrite the book, you hopefully are getting closer and closer to what you guys are going to read when you pick it up on a library shelf or a bookstore shelf. So I might go through like 7 or 8 rounds of revision though. And that is usually the longest part of writing a book for me. It takes about a year from the time I turn it in to the time when it's kind of like done and dusted and we say that's it, like that's as good as it's going to get. So a lot of revision. Hopefully I'm not rewriting something from scratch in the second draft and instead going in and making changes to the story that I already wrote. But sometimes it's a radical rewrite, but other times it's just always trying to get something right, get everything right all the way through. And then at the end, you're focused on one page or one chapter, and you're trying to get that one moment in the story right, and everything else is fixed. And you're just trying to get that in. Sometimes, a lot of times it's the very beginning. A lot of times it's the last page of a book. Those are awfully hard. How do you get into a story? How do you get out? Those take a lot of time.
When you first started writing books, were you worried at all if you could do it?
Oh yeah, was I worried that I could do it? I mean, I had some confidence. I'd grown up wanting to be a writer. I wrote my first book when I was in fifth grade. It didn't get published or anything, but I wrote it. I carried it around on a clipboard all through fifth grade, and I was really proud of it. At the end, it was called "Real Kids Don't Eat Spinach." I was really proud of that book, and it's never been published or anything, like I said. But it made me think I can do this. Of course, I was in fifth grade. I didn't know all the ways that things that had to happen for a book to really get published, and it's more complicated than that. But I kind of felt that confidence that as a writer, at least, that I could write the book. I'd have to figure out how you get published, but the writing of it, I felt like I could do. Then I went to college and I studied creative writing, and I felt pretty good about it then. I graduated and I kept sending stuff out, and I was getting these good rejection letters, but I felt like I was getting closer. I always felt like I had the talent and the ability, but was I ever going to get my breakthrough? Was I ever going to get somebody who loved a story that I wrote as much as I loved it? So there's definitely been a lot of times where I have doubted whether I was going to be able to break in, because you're always trying to find the right idea at the right time and the right person who responds to it, the right editor who responds to it to buy that book. And then after I was published, I have even written stuff that nobody's bought. And so there's a lot of times where I kind of think, oh my gosh, have I lost it? Did I never have it? Was I just lucky? I think in the life of any creative person, or anybody who performs, like an athlete or a musician or a dancer or a creator, an artist, like anybody who puts themselves out there and is trying to do something again and again and again, repeat it. There's always this doubt that, like, am I going to be able to do it again? Captain America was my 19th book. I think my 20th book, I think, will be the new one that comes out next year. And 20 books in, I still, every time I start one, think, I'm not sure I know how to do this. I'm not sure. And I have a system. I've done it 20 times. My books are being read by kids all over the world, which is awesome. And every time I start, I'm like, oh man, I hope I remember how to do this. I think that's just part of the creative process. And in a way, I hope I don't ever lose that, because I don't ever want to get so confident or that I believe I'm good without actually being good. Does that make sense? Like, I want to make sure that when I'm writing it, that I'm always a little scared. I think that helps.
Let me assure you, you know how to do this.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
What writers?
I need to call you up every time I'm starting a book and have you tell me that. That would help.
What writers had the most influence on you?
So when I was a kid, I really liked a book called Tuck Everlasting by Natalie Babbitt. That book is a book I still recommend. It's a very thin book, and it's a story of a family. I don't know if you guys know it, but it's a story of a family who find a magical spring in the woods that allows them to live forever. They drink from it. They don't ever get old. They don't ever die. And it's not an action-packed book. It's not a book that's like an edge-of-your-seat thriller, but it tackles some really tough, thoughtful stuff. Like, what does it mean to die? Like does without starting, if my daughter was here, I'd break into Circle of Life just to embarrass her. But what is the Circle of Life, and would it be bad if we all did live forever? And the book tackles these things. And when I was a kid, and still today, I was super afraid of dying. I was so afraid of dying that I would not go to sleep at night because I was afraid that I would die in my sleep, or I would be too timid to go on adventures or roller coasters or things because I was afraid that I might die. It was a huge, as soon as I understood that I was mortal as a kid, it frightened me. It really frightened me. And reading this book in 7th grade was the first time, and the most time the reaction from adults was, Alan, stop. You're not going to die for a long time. Don't worry about it. Just go to sleep. Just on the roller coaster. Just do whatever, right? Like it was kind of dismissive. And it was really hard for me to explain to people the sort of real dread that I had of dying. Like, I don't want to die. I want to live forever. I love the world. And so then I read this book in 7th grade, and it talks about death. And it was a book written for kids. It was a book written for me that talked about it in a serious way. It said, I see you. I hear that you're really worried about this, and let's talk about it. And it didn't really figure it out. I was still afraid of dying when I finished reading the book, but I loved that the book talked about it with me in a realistic way. in a very straightforward way. And that book had a huge impact on me as an adult writer. And I've always tried to write books like that, where I take you guys seriously. Like somebody out there may be really, really frightened about climate change, and this is a huge concern for them. And this book is going to take that seriously. Everybody else, I hope they still will read it and get something out of it. But there's somebody out there who's sort of, this is their main focus, or their thing that they're panicking, or they lost their home to a natural disaster from climate change. And this is very personal to them. Or there's a person out there who is a refugee, or who has refugees in their lives, and for whom that story is very personal. So I always try to remember I'm writing books for that kid me, and I never know what they're going to be most focused in on, what they're going to be most worried about in the world. I can't cover everything, but I have to remember that when I do cover something, when I do write about something, somebody out there, I hope, is feeling seen and feeling heard and saying, yes, yes, finally somebody's talking about this thing that really bothers me. So I always hold that book up and that author up as somebody who didn't write down to kids, who took kids seriously. And I feel the same way, and I try to do the same thing in my own books.
What advice do you have for young people who want to write?
Okay. If you want to be a writer, do either of you guys want to be a writer?
I do.
Uh,
I
all
want to
right.
be a movie writer.
Hey, that's awesome. That's writing. That's very cool. Script writing, comic book writing, podcast writing, nonfiction writing, magazine writing, newspaper writing, novel writing. It's all writing. That's awesome. And both of you are talking about telling stories. When I was a kid, I didn't know if I wanted to write books or write movies or write plays or comic books. I kind of wanted to do it all. I just wanted to tell stories, right? So that's awesome that you guys want to be storytellers. I love script writing too. I would love to write a TV show or a movie someday. That would be awesome. But advice for you guys and for other people who are watching or listening who want to be writers. Number one, you have to write a lot. And that sounds like super dumb because you're like, I just told you I want to be a writer. I'm like, I know. But I run into a lot of people who would say, I want to be a writer too. And I'm like, great, what have you written? And they say, well, I don't really have a lot of time for writing. I'm like, okay, then you're never going to be a writer. You have to make time. Like, the world is an awesome place. We have all of the great outdoors when it's, when we can go outside, that to explore. We have different countries to explore. We have different people to meet. We have TV shows to watch. We have movies to watch. We have video games to play. We have board games to play. We've got books to read. We got tons of great stuff to do in the world. Lots of things to draw our attention, let alone all the screens around us. So you have to chisel out time to write. You have to sit down. My friends and I call it BIC, butt in chair. You have to put your butt in the chair. You have to sit down at your computer or your notebook or whatever it is you like to write on. And you actually have to do the writing, right? There's a lot of people who sit around and daydream about it. But I could daydream all day about being a Major League Baseball player, and it isn't going to happen, right? So you got to actually go out. If you want to be a pro athlete, you got to do the practices, right? If you want to be a musician, you got to practice your instrument. If you want to be a writer, you got to sit down, put your butt in the chair, and do the writing. And then what you got to do is you got to write a story or a script or whatever it is, hand it off to your friends and family, have them read it, rewrite it, make it better, and then do it again. And do it again, and do it again, and do it again. So number one, you got to write, and you got to write a lot. Number two, you got to read. And that seems, you're like, okay, that's dumb because I already like books and stuff. So of course I would like to read. And I'm like, I know. But a lot of times I'll say to somebody, I know you want to be a writer. What are your favorite books, or what kind of genre do you want to write in? They're like, well, I don't really have a lot of time for reading. I'm like, okay, you got to read other people's books so you can see how they did it, how they created their characters, how they told their story, how they organized their stories, they structured them. When I first started to write, before I was ever published, I took the first Percy Jackson book, which I had already read, and I reread it, and I broke it down on note cards the way that I do here, so that I could pen it up and say, this is how he broke down his story. If you reverse outlined this story, this is down, right? You got to read other people's work so that you can figure out how they do things. You don't have to imitate it exactly, but by learning how other people do it, you can figure out how you want to do it. So you have to write a lot, you have to read a lot. And then my third thing is not quite so obvious as the other two, and that is right now start keeping an idea book. This is something that was told to me by a college professor when I was at the University of Tennessee. First day of class, I come in and he says, right now, when the class ends, go and buy yourself a notebook. And this is going to be your idea notebook, your craft notebook, CRAFT, craft notebook. This is not where you're going to write your stories. You're going to do that on your computer, on your typewriter, on your notebook, wherever it is you like to write. This idea book is going to be the place where you write down all your great ideas for stories that you haven't written yet. It's going to be where you write down all the advice that teachers like me or books that you read give you about writing. It's going to be the place where you write down sentences or lines from other people's poems or scripts or books that inspire you, not so you can copy them, but so you can be inspired by them and do try to do better than that. This is going to be your writer's notebook. And I thought this was brilliant. And I went out that day and I bought a notebook and I filled it over the course of the next year. And I continued to get notebooks and fill them up with ideas and craft notes. Now I've got a tablet and I have an app where I can put in the notes and be able to search them. But for a long time, I did it on physical notebooks, and I carried the new notebook around with me everywhere I went. So I always had it. And I've got 7 of those notebooks filled with ideas and craft notes and all kinds of good stuff. And then my notepad, my tablet is filled with all kinds of good stuff. So over the years, I've collected a whole bunch of stuff, and I probably won't ever get a chance to write all of it, but it's there, right? Because when you're writing one story, you'll come up with ideas for 10 more. And you got to write those down and have a place to store them. So my advice is write a lot, read a lot, and keep an idea notebook. I started mine in college, and those are treasures for me. If you guys start in grade school, oh my gosh, you'd have so much great stuff later on.
Can you tell us about an idea you have in your craft or tablet that you have that you really want to do but haven't quite started working on it yet?
Yeah, that's good. So I have always wanted to do a story about the Berlin Olympics of 1936. This is right before World War II began, and the Nazis had already taken power. And the Olympics were one of the very first modern Olympics. It was one of the first to be televised, and there was a lot of filming that went on at that Olympics. This is the Olympics where Jesse Owens won like 4 gold medals and disproved the Nazi Aryan supremacy idea. It's a really incredible story, the Olympics as a whole. And I've always wanted to write about it. And so I'm tinkering around right now. I've taken some notes about that in my notebooks over time, and I'm tinkering around with something there. Another note I have is I love the story of the Hindenburg, which was the big Zeppelin, the big blimp that exploded over New Jersey and sort of burned up as it crashed. And I'd love to write a story that's set on the Hindenburg. There's a story about kids who were given tanks at the end of World War II. The Germans had tanks, but nobody to drive them. So they and because all their adults were already at war or dead from the war, and so they called up a bunch of basically middle schoolers and high schoolers and put these kids in tanks and sent them out to stop the Americans and the British and the Russians who were all closing in on Berlin. That's a story I'd love to tell, and I have notes for that. Problem is, my main characters are Nazis, and I'm not sure how to tell that story. So sometimes I write down an idea in the book, and I'm like, this would be an amazing book, but I can't find a way into it. But writing it down puts it there and lets me think about it for a long time and lets me kind of let it percolate. And sometimes I'll be like, wait, now I think I know how to get into that story. And then I'll go back and look at all my notes, and then I can kind of make that into a new project moving forward. So that's just a few just off the top of my head that I know are in there that I'd love to write about someday.
I would definitely read those. Me too.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. If I can figure it out, I'll do it.
Which of your books do you think would make the best movie?
Hmm. All of them would be great. No, I would love to see my books turned into movies. I've always thought that Project 1065 is a really fun thriller, and it has history. It's about a kid who's a spy in the Hitler Youth. I've always thought that would make a really good thriller. Code of Honor, I think, is another good, straight up sort of Jason Bourne sort of thriller with a kid as the main character. But I really hope if I only got one book ever made into a movie, and I may never have anything made into a movie, I would hope that it would be Refugee. It's not as much of a edge of your seat thriller as Code of Honor or Project 1065, But I wrote that book for a reason. I wanted to shine a light on the refugee crisis that is still going on all over the world. There are more refugees in the world right now than at any time in human history, and that includes World War II, when half the world was at war and people were dislodged from their homes because their homes were battlefields. So even without a world war going on, we have more refugees right now than at any time in human history. So I would love for that book to get made into a movie, because I want that message to get out even farther. You know, Abigail, you were talking about wanting to write movies. The thing about movies versus books, I love writing books, and it's my number one passion and my home as a writer. But if a TV show or a movie only has 1 million people watch it, it's a failure. TV shows get canceled if they only have 1 million people watching them. If your book has 1 million readers, you hit the New York Times bestseller list. So that's the difference between success in books and success in movies. Movies mean so many more eyeballs. A successful movie is going to have tens of millions of people who watch it. And if you want a message to get out, like I do with Refugee, then the book's great, and it gets that message out to millions of people. But if I want tens of millions of people to hear that message, I'd love for it to become a movie. So if I could choose one, it would be Refugee, partially because I love the story, but also partially because I really want that message to get in front of as many people as possible.
Refugee would make a good movie.
Cool, I appreciate that. It's the one I've gotten closest with. A movie company came to me a few years back and said, we want to turn Refugee into a movie. I was like, oh, heck yeah, let's do it. And they hired a screenwriter. He wrote up a script. It was really good. I read it. And they were getting ready to go out and talk to directors and maybe actors. And then guess what happened? COVID happened, the same thing that shut everything down, right? So everything was getting ready to start rolling. And then all of Hollywood shut down, all the world shut down, and it lost momentum. And now Hollywood is, of course, getting fired back up, and they're making movies again, and we're all getting back out in the world. But it kind of lost momentum. So we've got to get that ball rolling all over again. So fingers crossed that it happens. There's nothing I can do about it. As the author of the book, I just kind of have to hope that, just like I had to find an editor who loved my book enough to publish it, I have to find a movie company who loves the story enough to make it into a movie.
Finally, it's time for Turbo 10. 10 rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I am ready. Lay it on me.
Number 1, what is your favorite phrase to use?
Oh, I can see my house from here.
Number 2, what is one subject you'd love to learn more about?
Oh, oh man, puppets.
Number 3, what is your go-to snack food?
Oh, plain M&Ms.
Number 4, what was your favorite book growing up?
The Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster.
Number 5, if you could teleport somewhere right now, where would you go?
Oh, the Women's World Cup in New Zealand.
Number 6, if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Super speed. Super speed. The Flash. I want to be the Flash.
Number 7, what was your favorite cartoon as a kid?
Oh, my favorite cartoon. Oh my gosh. There was a cartoon called Thundar the Barbarian. I love that one.
Number 8, what is your favorite rainy day activity?
Reading.
Number 9, if you could have any 3 dinner guests, who would they be?
3 dinner guests. Jim Henson, who did the Muppets, Muhammad Ali, who's a boxer, and Benjamin Franklin. I think that would be a pretty funny dinner party.
Number 10, what is the best piece of advice you were ever given?
Oh, best piece of advice I was ever given. Always start my stories in the middle of the action. They call it in medias res in Latin. Always start as close to the story as possible. That's good advice for any writer.
You were amazing. Thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for spending this time with us. We can't wait to read your future books.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. I had a great time. Great questions. Keep reading and keep writing.
Will do.